Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today to the Mad Mamluks podcast. My name is Sarah, and I'm here on behalf of the Heroic Hearts organization. And for those of you who don't know, HHO runs a lot of different initiatives simultaneously for war-torn communities like food baskets, winter aid, emergency relief, but our biggest initiative, and I would say definitely the most rewarding, is orphan sponsorship. And providing for orphans has always been the main focus and goal for the organization. And with that goal in mind, instead of holding a traditional fundraiser, we decided to do something a little bit different. So in May, we will be hosting a 5K run walk over in Wheaton at the Donata Forest Preserve, which is absolutely beautiful. And we really want this event to be a way to get people outdoors, doing something active for a good cause. And this is really different than the fundraisers we typically see in Chicago. And we think that this is going to be a really enjoyable event for the whole family. We've even talked to a few of the registered participants, and we have like families where all three generations are participating, which is really exciting. Grandparents are going to be out walking, parents are going to be out possibly running, and children will be participating in the 100-yard dash, which will take place immediately after the 5K. And I have to say that the 100-yard dash is so much fun for the kids, but even more fun for the parents to watch from the sidelines. So there really is something for everyone. We've got a lot of local companies who are going to be out there representing. We're going to have some cool prizes for runners. And most importantly, we're going to be out there as a community, taking action together and making a difference in the lives of hundreds of children who have really lost everything due to senseless wars. So the cause is it's totally worth all of us making a little bit of extra effort to wake up earlier on Saturday, May 13th, join your community out in Wheaton to make a difference. So I ask all of you to please check out our Facebook page for the run. It's just called the Heroic Hearts 5K. Get your family and friends on board, help us with some marketing, spread the word. And we're also looking for volunteers. So if you're interested in helping us out day of, you can email us at heroichearts5k@gmail.com. And please check us out on Facebook as soon as possible. And we hope to have you all on board. For more information on the 5K, you can also check out the Mad Mamluks show notes. And we'll see you on May 13th.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Mad Mamluks. I'm Mahin, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Mort and Sim. Today we got a very special friend on the show today, Asim Ahmed, who is a pilot and a history buff. You know, we've known Asim for several years. He's a good friend of ours, a good friend of the show. And many of y'all may not know him, but we felt like he's an interesting guy that we wanted to share with the rest of our listeners. And, you know, I just think that's part of the platform that the Mad Mamluks is about. We have mentioned before, we are not about always presenting people who are going to be like the most famous people, etc. But we want people who are going to present engaging, interesting conversations. So awesome, first of all. Jazakallah khair for coming into the show today. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much for having me, everyone.
So tell us a little bit about yourself as far as your background, as far as schooling goes, and like how you got involved into history.
I've always loved history. Usually there's the people who lean towards humanities and the liberal arts, and the people who end up being engineers and accountants and make all the money, right? So I was one of those people who always history was second nature to me throughout school, going back to grade school. And then I was actually briefly a journalism major, and then I just went back to my first love, which was history, in college. And most pre-law people are actually history majors, so it's a very common pre-law.
Asim's one of those dudes that I always wanted to be. He went and did what he wanted instead of taking the safe approach that I ended up taking by going into IT and just doing the safe thing.
All the like parents are like, oh, you got to be a doctor, engineer, right?
No, he went and became a pilot after 9/11, right, Asim?
Yeah, that's correct. Which a lot of people still. They get taken aback by that and quite shocked.
So talk about that for a little bit. Like, what drove you to become a pilot after 9/11?
Well, I was going to do it before 9/11. I wasn't going to let that stop me, essentially. I'm one of those guys who never really truly grew up. I wanted to be like Luke Skywalker flying Beggar's Canyon, or like Maverick on Top Gun,
Nice, yeah.
I wasn't going to let...
Dude, Top Gun was one of the most influential movies for me as growing up. I actually had called a Navy recruiter to my house, and my dad flipped when he called and setting up the schedule. to come visit us and talk to us about the Navy's fighter jet program. And my dad's like, no son of mine's going to join the Army. It was nothing about it being anti-American. It was just like he had other expectations of me that he wanted me to pursue. But what happened was, that dream ended up crashing, and I went into IT. So,
well, it's like the story of every Chicago Daisy.
You can live vicariously through me, sir. So,
yeah.
No, talk to us a little bit about that parental pushback. Like when you said, "I'm going to do history," right? You know, I remember a lot of like friends of mine growing up. They told their parents something similar. I want to study philosophy or history, and they're like, "Oh, that's fine, but you're just going to pay for yourself now. Like we're not supporting you anymore." And that causes this predicament where like, okay, I'm going to do engineering. If I can get college paid for, which is a big deal, I'll do computer science or engineering, and I'll hate my life after. But it's all good. Like, how did you deal with that?
Well, I just didn't tell my parents. That's how I dealt with it. Well, I did try to be a computer science major in the middle there too, between journalism and history, to try to keep them happy. And I wasn't happy. And I basically concealed it, which is how, honestly, many people from our culture, unfortunately, deal with these things. We end up having to cope with it somehow, you know. So I just didn't tell them, just because I knew they'd be disappointed. So I just kind of told them later, after the fact. So and they weren't happy about it, but you know But then, of course, I told them, well, I have a backup plan. I want to actually be a pilot, which is a real career. So then they kind of came on board.
Did you go to one of those infamous flight schools in Florida?
I did go to an infamous flight school.
Oh my God! Any interesting story from that?
You know,
anyone know anyone in particular?
They had a lot of foreign contracts, including Saudi pilots.
Yeah.
In fact, that really hurt them financially because all the Saudi pilots they all took their business to Europe mostly, Canada and places like that after 9/11. So,
wow.
And in town, I would talk to the barber or the people at the restaurants, and they'd all say, "Oh, we really miss those guys," because they kept the economy afloat. So
yeah. So did you encounter any challenges, like when you enrolled and considered that you were Muslim, and after 9/11, like was there anything that particularly stood out when you were attending the school?
No, I mean I had to. Like going away to Jummah, I would just call it a prayer meeting. I wouldn't tell them I have to go to Jummah khutbah at 1, please. I'd say, I got to go to a prayer meeting. So in the South, I don't know if they thought that meant I was going to go do, sing gospel music somewhere with somebody.
Yeah.
Sing Kumbaya with somebody. I just call it a prayer meeting. And then I went, in Ramadan, I would just, disappear at iftar time or try to schedule my flying around that.
How does Ramadan work while you're flying?
I still fast because I feel like yes, you're a musafir, but then, it's my job. I'm not just a musafir temporarily. It's an actual full-time job for me. And also there's the barakah of Ramadan, right? We all know about that. I mean, you can, sure, if you miss, you can make up, but then I'd be making up half the month.
Right.
And that's a lot of fast to make up. And again,
how many hours are you fasting? Well, what schedule are you using?
I mean, I'm generally for suhoor, I'm almost always on the ground. So I just, stop, eating and drinking. I wake up early, of course, and stop based on the local time. And then I actually do the same thing for iftar. I try to be on the ground for that because I do domestic flights. But if I'm not, then I just do it by the local time of where I'm at. So.
But you stay domestic pretty much. So
I pretty much stay domestic. So it's, absolutely. I don't know what I'd do if I had to do long haul. It would be a whole different story. Yeah. So.
But it's still a challenge. Like Ramadan for a lot of us is, especially the first few days, I always see, stories of our friends falling asleep at work and power naps, and you can't do that when you're flying, right?
Yeah.
Like when you're in flight, is there like a chill time, or are you on it, like focused in, like dialed in the whole way?
No, there's absolutely, everyone.
What are the limitations of autopilot is what we want to know.
Autopilot.
How much work do you actually do?
We still do a lot of work. We put in a lot of, we have a lot of time off, but when we're on duty, they can be up to 15-hour days sometimes. Now, of course, that's not 15 hours in the airplane in the cockpit. Usually, our flight time is capped at about 8 hours. We can go a little bit. Obviously, if we have a delay airborne, it's like, oh no, we're illegal. You're already in the air. What are you going to do? It's like, okay, we have to keep flying. But we work hard when we have to. There's busy times. People say flying is hours of boredom punctuated by minutes of sheer terror. When I say terror, I mean like really excitement. Like,
okay,
you're really
you got to
busy.
be very careful.
Yes, I have to be careful with that word. That's why I'm prefacing what I mean by terror. So it's no, of course, autopilot is just a computer. It's garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
So it's only
does autopilot work with landing?
Under certain circumstances, it does. You have
But
to.
normally you'd probably do it manual, right? Or no?
Yeah, normally every landing, especially the actual touchdown part,
Yeah.
and also taxi off. No autopilot can actually taxi on the ground. So at most, it might be able to touch down and land, but then you have to take control of it.
Is that the real measuring tool of a good pilot? The way he lands? Because that's when I really want to.
The general public, it is.
Yeah.
But I compare flying to. It's almost like those gymnastics routines you see in the Olympics.
Right.
You can do everything right, but they still judge you on that dismount when you actually land on the mat, and then if you bounce or if you get all squirrely, then people dock points. And that's how landings are.
For me, I don't really care. As long as I'm in one piece.
Yes, that's how you should look at it. You're safe. You're able to walk away from the airplane.
No, I send the compliments. You know how you send the compliments to the chef after a good meal? I send the compliments to the pilot through one of the hostesses. Yeah, for after a landing, I'm like, my compliments to the pilot.
Actually, we appreciate that. And in fact, you can actually duck your head in, or sometimes, of course, we stand right outside the flight deck. And
a bad landing will scare me, man.
No, to me, honestly, landing, I'm not sure what bothers me the most about being in the air, and I never get used to, is turbulence.
Oh, yeah.
Turbulence is something I've flown so many times, and I will never get used to turbulence. And I had the most crazy story one time where, literally I thought I was going to die, and I saw this guy next to me that was basically he was freaking out.
It's serious business, yeah.
Yeah, and when I saw him freaking out, though, I started laughing. For some reason, I don't know why, just the way he freaked out. And the guy thought the whole way that I was a crazy psychopath. Because we're about to die and you're laughing. I'm sorry, I couldn't help it, but you were making some crazy faces. But point being, it's turbulence I can never get used to.
Why can't they just go higher in the air? To avoid turbulence.
You can't. It's not always a question of altitude.
What is turbulence? What is it? Why do we have turbulence?
Usually, it's associated with varying wind speed and direction. On the ground, it's called wind shear. You have turbulence on the ground too. When it gets real choppy right before you touch down, that's not turbulence anymore. At that point, it's more wind shear. When you have to think of the atmosphere as an ocean, right? Air, they call it hydrodynamics. These laws apply in the atmosphere as well. So you have to think of it as you're a boat or a submarine more.
So these are waves.
These are waves, yeah. Waves of air coming. There's jet stream, of course, is a famous name for turbulence. And then you have, of course, pressure is a big factor. You have convective turbulence, which is one of the most common types. That's associated with thunderstorms. So that's the kind that really rocks you. That's easy, though. You see a thunderstorm, you avoid it. And thunderstorms are easy to see and avoid. But the problem is when you have clear air turbulence, you got a perfectly clear day. Or mountain turbulence, like if you're flying by Denver or something over the Rockies, there's always turbulence. So
that's
you have
exactly
to think
where this happened to me.
Yeah.
We were going to Nevada, and this is what happened.
Yeah. Basically, you have to think of it as waves of air crashing against the mountains. You can't see them, but you can see the evidence. Like if you see a certain type of cloud, it's called a lenticular cloud. If you see lenticular clouds, you know it's going to be choppy. So you see cumulonimbus, the big mushroom-shaped clouds, or huge popcorn kernel type clouds.
Right.
You know it's going to be choppy around those, or anvil shaped.
Are lightning still a problem for? Yeah, I mean, I remember those old 70s movies where the lightning strike hits the engine of the air, and then the Mayday, and then you're.
Lightning is
still a problem?
Is a threat. It does. I personally have not been struck by lightning that I know of anyway. But it's not necessarily a major emergency. It all depends on where on the aircraft the lightning hits.
Yeah.
If it hits in a critical area and you lose your electrics, then that's obviously an emergency. If your screens go dark and the lights go out, that's an emergency. You need to land and get on the ground. But if just like a building, studded with, you've got your lightning rods on buildings, and we have our static strips, basically. We call them static wicks. These are these little wicks, some of you may be familiar and you may have seen them. They're all over the trailing edge of the rudder and on the wings as well. You'll see them. And, they're there to help us dissipate that lightning.
Yeah, I mean, I think homes also have that too, a way to dissipate the electricity after your home gets hit by lightning.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So, all right, awesome. Let's segue back to your history stuff. So, one of the reasons we wanted to have you on today is because this mad Mamluk right here, I don't even think I know what a Mamluk is. I just heard it was a Russian slave that like stopped some Mongols. You know what I'm saying? Can you educate us? Please educate the mad Mamluks on who the Mamluks really were.
Absolutely, I'm very
Mamluk Nation, pay attention very closely because we're going to be asking some trivia quizzes later.
Absolutely.
We might have some prizes.
Mamluk, plural is Mamalik, actually. So we have the mad Mamalik here with me. But Mamluk just means something owned. And it's very similar to another word, which is ghulam. In fact, some of us even have that as in our names. People actually use that as their name. And ghulam was similar to Mamluk. It's something or someone usually owned. So property, we'll call it what it is, slavery, obviously was an institution that lasted a long time, both in the West and in Islamic lands. So there were slaves in going back to the Abbasid period. This is, of course, one of those many pre-Islamic practices which Islam adopted, which, of course, it's common, especially from the Persian Empire. So it's not something that Muslims invented, military slaves, but we absolutely embraced that policy. And it's lasted 1,000 years in Islam. Actually, it goes back to the Abbasid period, all the way to almost the end of the Ottoman period. So,
how did the Mamluks even enter the Muslim world? I understood the Mamluks as a steppe people. They were slaves that were imported into the Muslim world from the steppe land. And let's explain what steppe is also.
Sure. The Central Asian steppes, they're these, you can think of them as these big plateaus and prairies almost, kind of like the American prairies, except they would gradually, change in elevation. So they weren't steep like the mountains, but so they called them steppes. So
it's very important people understand the steppe because the steppe is a very rough climate and people are grown up very hard in
climate.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And
so you have to be a tough individual to live in these
climates. And the steppes, you're living off yak milk in these you're using your horse for everything, your horse and your herd to survive. Everything comes from those animals. You're nomadic generally. There's very few cities on the steppe. Largely nomadic people, whether you're Turkish or Tartar or Mongol. These are the famous peoples of the steppe. And this goes back, of course, to the Roman period, where you may have heard of the Huns. Right. They were steppe people too. And that's the thing. The steppes are the source of these people who often are unsettled people and nomadic. And, these settled cities, they make tempting targets for steppe people to raid. So you become a raider at that point. So
the Mamluks were a steppe people. And it's important that we understand that because their main adversary, we later on end up learning, were the Mongols. So who are also steppe people, and before the Mongols and the Mamluks had even met, the Mongols hadn't been stopped at all. So let's rewind a little bit and start from the beginning and how the Mamluks ended up in, or these steppe people ended up in the Muslim world.
Sure. They initially were largely what we call Turk. Now Turk, almost like Saracen. You have heard of the word Saracen, which the Muslims called all the European, lighter-skinned European Christians, we called them all Franks. That was our catch-all term, right? Yeah. Frank or a Frange or Ferengi even.
We didn't use the word infidel?
No. Shocking, right? Yeah. Infidel. Wow. No. We generally call them a Frange or Ferengi or just And they had their words for us. One was, of course, Saracen, and the other was Turk. Now, Turk became this catch-all term for a lot of these steppe people that we just talked about. And the majority of the Mamluks were basically Turks. They were basically Kipchak Turks, initially from the Golden Horde area. Now, if you're Golden Horde, that's a whole different long subject, but that was one of the Mongol kingdoms. The Mongols initially, of course, we all know about Genghis Khan, but after he died, they fragmented into basically 4 different
because the empire became so large.
Absolutely. So there's the Ilkhans, like Hulagu. We've all heard of Hulagu, of course. That was one of them. The Ilkhans, they sacked Baghdad. And then you have the Chugtais. The Chugtais were the ancestors of Timur and the Mughals, of course, who later ruled India. The Chugtai was right in Central Asia. And then you had the Golden Horde. And the Golden Horde were among the first to embrace Islam, actually.
Yeah.
And they were more like the Caucasus and Ukraine area more.
And they kind of also worked to protect the Muslim world from their other brothers.
Absolutely. Ironically, the Mongols, one of their bigger civil wars was over this issue. The Muslim Mongols, the Golden Horde, allied with their cousins, the Mamluks, against the Ilkhans, which were again the people who attacked Baghdad and ended the Abbasid Empire, who were also allied with the Crusaders. So you had this four-way system, 2-on-2.
So what time period did the Mamluks first enter the Muslim world? Let's say this is before they even became rulers.
Absolutely. That goes back to actually the 10th century. So in Al-Hijra, it would be about, the 3rd century Al-Hijra. So we're talking about the 900s. During the Abbasid period, they became, the Abbasids became very dependent upon them. In fact, so dependent that that's one of the reasons why their power in Baghdad started to dissolve, because they relied so much on these military slaves. So it started in the 10th century, and of course Mamluks were around all the way until the 19th century. But that was the first period, the Abbasids, and then almost every subsequent major dynasty in Islam used military cavalry.
Yeah, even the Janissaries with the Turks.
Absolutely, that was the Ottomans.
Ottomans.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So how did they end up getting power?
The Mamluks gained power in several places. The first Muslim dynasty in India was also a Mamluk dynasty.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. The first Mamluk dynasty. And in fact, speaking of defeating the Mongols, again, the Mongols tried to invade India as well. And they were defeated again by their Turkish cousins in India also. We all know about how they were defeated in Ain Jalut, but they were also defeated in India.
Was this closer like Chittagong and Bangladesh, that area?
No, in Delhi area.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
There was they were called the Khiljis and Tughlaq. They were all Turkish, basically. Wow. The first Muslim dynasties who ruled India long before I'm talking about 400 years before the Mughals. No, the Mughals.
Oh, well.
We all know about the Mughals in India.
Yeah.
But 400 years before the Mughals ever came around, they were the original Turks and the Turkish Delhi Sultanates, I should say. And the first one was called the Mamluk dynasty of India.
Wow.
So some modern day Indian people are descendants of these folks.
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, in some parts of India, again, many of the Hindu natives of India, just like the Westerners use Turk for Muslim, in some parts of India, even to this day, when a Hindu says Turk, he means Muslim. Wow. Because they associated that word so closely. Yeah. So
cool. So now I understand the original Mamluk founder was a woman by the name of Shajara Dur.
Well, not the original Mamluk. Now we're getting to the Egyptian Sultanate.
Yeah.
Is where we're going. Yeah. Right? So the Mamluks were in India, and then the Mamluks were, of course, in the Abbasid Empire, the Abbasid Khilafah also. But now, getting to the famous Mamluks of history, which is the Sultanate. Yeah. You're right. That was the Ayyubids, right? Right before the Mamluks, you had the Ayyubids. Everybody knows the Ayyubids because Salahuddin was, of course, the first major Ayyubid.
And at this time, the Muslim Empire is... There's the Abbasids in Iraq area, right? Before it was sacked.
This is right before the sacking, actually. Like years, a handful of years.
Yeah.
And the Fatimids had just recently been...
Salahuddin is the one who effectively ends the Fatimids. You're correct. But
now, is it true the Fatimids had some allegiances with Crusaders as well, too? Like at that time?
It was very complicated. I could spend all day talking about the Crusades. But yes, there were Crusaders. Spain was the same way. Muslim Spain was the same way, too. You had, at times they were adversaries, at times they were allies. And you had Christian kings allying with Muslim rulers against fellow Christians, and Muslim rulers allying against, with
so
the Christians.
Just one big power grab.
Yes, because you had the Byzantines, of course, the Orthodox Christians up in Constantinople, who also at times allied with the Muslims because they didn't like the Latin Catholics coming in on their crusades and disrupting the status quo in the Middle East at times too.
So when people say Mamluks, in today's time, they're mainly referring to the Mamluks in Egypt. Right?
Absolutely, yeah. They're talking about the Mamluk dynasty.
Those are the most famous
Mamluks. They're the most famous, and they actually ruled and put their stamp on Egypt.
So tell us a little bit about how that came to be. How did the Mamluks get power in Egypt?
In Egypt, it's as I was mentioning the Ayyubid dynasty of Salahuddin. Now, that only really lasted for less than maybe about 50 years, say 50, 60 years. Salahuddin and then his brother Al-Adil and then his sons, Kamil and a handful more. There were less than 10 Ayyubid sultans. The last one, Salih Ayyub, basically was fighting off the Crusaders, because this was the 7th Crusade. French king Louis IX had invaded Egypt.
Right.
And he occupied Damietta, which is a famous Nile Delta city. And then he occupied Mansoura, And in Mansoura, it was a hard-pressed battle, but his Mamluks... Now, at this point, they weren't rulers. They weren't the sultans of Egypt. They were just... Like I said, going back 200 years to the Abbasid, they were just their cavalry. Because the Mamluks, you have to think of them as... the mounted knights of Islam, right? Everybody knows about the Templar Knights and the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights of St. John, and all these orders.
Yeah.
Well, in Islam, we had heavy cavalry too in Islamic history, and they were the Mamluks generally.
So they would go where they were needed.
Yeah, they were the mounted cavalry, who just like they weren't always just guys with lances. They often were, but they were also known for their archery skills, horseback archers.
Right.
Just like their Mongol cousins.
That makes sense because they're the Mongols.
Right? Absolutely, just like their Mongol cousins. Yeah. They were unlike the Western.
So they must have been expert horse fighters as well too. Though.
Absolutely, unlike the Western knights, were generally not archers. Right? They just had the very heavy armor and the really long lance, like the jousting type knights we see. They weren't known for archery, but the Mamluks were known for both very precise archery and had heavy armor.
And this was one of their greatest techniques, right? They would cause a storm of arrows, and that would cause disarray among.
And they were able to do those feint attacks, where they would feint, like get you to attack, and then they would retreat and get you to keep chasing them until they got you in the position they wanted, and then they would actually do a pincer movement and surround you. And that was a classic technique for those types of soldiers.
So now Henry VIII is attacking...
No, this is actually, Louis IX.
I'm sorry. Louis the
France.
You're thinking of Henry VIII with all his wives, I know.
France was attacking the...
Yes, this was Egypt. The 7th Crusade. Of course, you can imagine. I mean, just think about that time in Muslim history. I mean, we talk about how bad things are now, but this is a period of history. But imagine, we had 7 different crusades launched at the heart of Islam. Plus, you had the Mongols attacking us from the... I mean, honestly, as bad as things are now, I don't think we can compare it.
And then you had fellow Muslims also conspiring against you.
Yeah, so... in this context, you had Baybars, who was very famous, of course, and one of the most prominent Mamluks. He and Qutuz were all, at this point, they weren't rulers. They were just emirs. It was almost a feudal system. And this last Ayyubid Sultan... used them effectively to defeat the Crusaders, and they were defeated.
So were they always stationed in Egypt, or did he call them from outside?
No, in fact, the Mamluks early on, of course, they were dominant in places like Syria and Iraq, and it's only under Salahuddin's time when he moved them. His uncle Shirkuh, who was a very famous soldier himself too, Shirkuh had a whole platoon of Mamluks and who helped the Ayyubids defeat the Fatimids, right, and displace them, and then establish the... And then there were Mamluks who fought at the famous Battle of Hittin, too, right? We all know about the Battle of Hittin, Saladin's victory over the Crusaders. I mean, a lot of the mounted knights who were fighting against the Templar Knights were Mamluks. So the Mamluks had been around and were well known. And they were generally, like I said, Turks, Kipchak Turks. But yeah, this incident with the 7th Crusade, that's when they finally... The last Ayyubid Sultan, Salih Ayyub, he died, and they actually concealed his death at first because they thought, okay, well, we're already under attack, and the Crusaders are occupying our land, so we have to hide it. So they hid it. And one of his concubines, Shajarat ad-Dur, which means Tree of Pearls, she actually ended up marrying...
I thought she was her first wife, or no?
Well, I don't remember if she was a concubine or a wife.
Yeah.
But
I think she was the concubine who became his wife.
I think,
she bore him a child.
That was often what happened in these cases, right?
She bore him a child and she became his wife.
So she was actually de facto the first ruler, the transitional ruler of the Mamluks. So many historians consider her to be the first, which is interesting for a female. So
because he had apparently passed away or whatnot.
she summoned his son Turan Shah, who would have been the next in line to be the Ayyubid Sultan. But Turan Shah was not popular with the Mamluks, so he was actually... it's controversial, just like many of these killings, but they say that he was killed by his own Mamluks. Okay. So they were often kingmakers, right? And this goes back to the Abbasid period as well, is that the problem is they're military slaves, but later they become so powerful that they become the kingmakers. If they don't like the Sultan or the Khalifa in charge, they say, well, we don't like you, and they kill you. So, and they did this in Ottoman times as well with the Janissaries. So that's when Turan Shah was killed. that's when basically there was one Mamluk again who took power briefly, and then Sultan Qutuz, Muzaffar Qutuz, became the first really powerful.
Tell us about Muzaffar Qutuz, because I think this is where I think most people highlight the Mamluks against the
Mongol invasion.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about Muzaffar and how he came into power.
Well, Muzaffar Qutuz, he became Sultan Qutuz. Basically the third sultan of the Mamluks, and right away they had repulsed the Crusader invasion, but it wasn't over because when Saladin had defeated them at the Battle of Hittin, he still famously he left Acre, that town. If you know your Crusader history, that was one of the biggest mistakes he made, because that enabled King Richard the Lionheart to land, because as long as they had one port right on the Mediterranean, which they did, that was the one port. So he managed to defeat them and remove them from all of their which included Antioch, Edessa, all of these counties, right, and Jerusalem itself. He managed to defeat them and lay siege to them and win, with the exception of Acre. So that's when the Crusaders came in Acre, and then again they expanded. So this is about 50 years after the time of Saladin. Now the Crusaders were back in many of these places, in Antioch, in Tyre. These places are in Lebanon and the Lebanese and Middle East, Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean coast. So the Mamluks actually were still trying to fight the Crusaders. At the same time, they heard about the shock in 1258, which was the sack of Baghdad. This was so the Mamluks, you can date them to about 1250. So just 8 years later, they're very new. 8 years is nothing. Brand new dynasty. The transition from the Ayyubids to the Mamluks was relatively seamless. So the Ayyubids ruled Syria and Egypt. And with the exception of those few coastal towns ruled by the Crusaders, they controlled that area. But now you heard about Hulagu coming in, and 1258 he sacks Baghdad. So that's a huge shock. And that's when this famous letter...
Let's talk about that for a moment. For some of the listeners. Why was the sacking of Baghdad a shock to the Muslim world? Like, what was the significance of Baghdad at this time?
And what was the relationship with the Abbasids to the Ayyubids and the Abbasids? Because sometimes people mistakenly think that the Ayyubids were their own caliphate and the Abbasids were their own. But as I understand it, the Ayyubids had paid homage to and had given their the bayah.
Yeah, absolutely. The Abbasids, as far as political power goes, it had been, like I said, about 200 years since they held real political power, which is about the 900s AD. But one way was on the two main ways were currency, so the coins would be struck in the name of that ruler, and the Jummah Khatibs. The Khatibs would every Friday, even if you were in a place like Cairo or Damascus, which may not actually be under the political control of the Abbasid ruler in Baghdad, but they would still mention his name, the Abbasid, Al-Mutasim or Al-Mutawakkil,
right,
or somebody like that. They would still mention his name, even though it may be ruled by, Nuruddin Zengi or Mamluk Sultan like Baybars, or Qutuz. They would still name the Abbasid Khalif. So that showed the unity of the Sunni Muslim world, at least.
Right.
Is that okay? He may not have political power, and the Seljuks did this too, and even the Ottomans did for a time, until they declared themselves, of course, the new caliphs, the new khalifas. So the Ayyubids also, in fact, at the Battle of Hittin, and they actually also flew the black flag, the famous black flag of the Abbasids. So they had their own flags, and the Abbasids had their own contingent sent too. So they didn't have much power, but Baghdad still held a symbolic value, right? Everybody knows about Harun al-Rashid and al-Mansur and all these stories of the glory of Baghdad. So that's why it was a symbol.
Contained a lot of knowledge and information.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it was a center for learning at that time.
Yeah, outside of Cairo and Damascus, it was, which were... Actually, Cairo was still relatively... Of course, it was Fatimid for a while here, for about a century or so. Which was, of course, the only Shia Khilafah, the Fatimid Khilafah. So all that left in the Middle East as far as the original centers of power was just Damascus and Baghdad. And Baghdad was, of course, the capital of the Muslim world, if not politically, then still culturally and economically and many other ways. So that's why it was such a big shock when Hulagu sacked it. And famously, the rivers ran red and black from blood and the ink of the books. We've all heard these stories. So
okay. So now we hear so now the Mamluks know that Baghdad has been sacked, and now they're taken aback by this. So now what happens at this point?
Well, that was Genghis Khan's plan, was to basically conquer the whole known world. So he sends Hulagu, who's his grandson actually, and he sends Hulagu to continue pushing through Persia, which he does. And now they enter and they sack parts of Anatolia, which is of course Turkey now, and then they go into the Levant, Bilad al-Sham. So now they attack Damascus. They lay siege to all these cities, Aleppo, Damascus, and they've all heard that Egypt is like the big, stronghold of Islam now. So they send this famous letter, and Qutuz is the one who gets this letter about, our armies are coming for you, just surrender. And it's actually a very evocative letter. It's and it would make anybody else shake in their boots when they hear this letter that Hulagu sent to Qutuz. But his response, which was very effective, was he beheaded the two Mongols who sent him the letter, and he put their heads on pikes.
Yeah.
On the gates of Cairo.
Yeah, I mean, the letter was very offensive. It basically told the Caliph that he'll be tossed around like a lion, and it was a very humiliating letter. And normally, I think emissaries are considered, sacred, and you'd never touch them. But he felt like he needed to send a message back to him, just showing him that they're not scared of him.
Yeah.
And he killed the emissaries, and he put them on their heads on a spike and sent it back, sending a message. And that was the worst thing to do.
Yep,
because
absolutely.
it really enraged the Mongols, and it really released the full wrath of the Mongols onto Baghdad.
But it's also like an intimidation point, right?
Absolutely.
The thing of it is, I was talking to a friend of mine who had studied overseas, and they were talking about the the fiqh of jihad, and that's stuff they studied. And one of the things is the ruling on mutilating a body, and they says the scholars are unanimous in that it's not permissible, except if there's some kind of maslaha or greater benefit. And they said one of them is as a way to intimidate the enemy. So it looks like that's kind of the situation that happened here.
I mean, I think you have to understand the tone of the letter too. It wasn't like a letter of negotiation or to talk. They literally just sent a threatening letter.
It was an ultimatum.
They wanted to basically wipe out. And I think they even made religious references into the letter as well too. At some point, I forgot.
Yeah, they basically say that your God will not save you.
Yeah, and so they basically humiliated anyone that read that letter.
Yeah.
And it was meant to be intimidating to the Muslims and not even a point of negotiation. So they were very tough in their methods of
it was funny.
It was very aggressive.
Genghis Khan, didn't he used to say to the Muslims, like, I am, even though he didn't believe in Allah, he was like, I am your God's punishment upon you.
The flail of God. Yeah, they used to call the Mongols the flail of God for both the Christians and the Muslims, because they were equal opportunity killers. The Mongols, they attacked both Muslims and Christians. So,
they said that they're the punishment for the sins that they've been doing.
Yeah,
it was just a psychological. It's not that they believed it. It was just a psychological attack.
It was effective.
It was more of a mockery that, you believe in this, and so I'm going to use this to intimidate you with your own belief. I could care less about it, but I'm just gonna, even your God, basically your God's forsaking you. You know what I mean? He chose me over you. Basically that type of mentality. So now after this happens, they attack Baghdad, right? And now Baghdad has collapsed. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it only took the Mongols like 2 weeks to totally sack all of Baghdad.
Absolutely.
And they destroyed the books. I even heard stories where the Muslims were so terrified of them coming into Baghdad that they were actually like hiding on the rooftops. They were hiding in graves. And there was actually an interesting story about the Mongols where even after the point where the Mongols left, they had left some people behind. I think a Mongol woman. I heard the story, so I'm not sure how true it is or verified, but apparently the Muslims started coming out of their hiding spots, and one guy ends up going to the masjid, and there's a Mongol woman that's looting there. Mm-hmm. And she tells him, stay right here so I can bring my axe to finish you. And he was so terrified that he actually stood there and waited for her to come back and execute. Is that really a true story?
I've heard of this story too. A lot of these are probably apocryphal, almost... a
little bit of exaggeration.
Yeah, there's a lot of exaggeration as well.
That's something I couldn't verify.
But it's almost something you tell a little child to scare them to sleep. But but that's how terrifying they were. They were the stuff of nightmares for the Muslim world.
For the whole world at that time. For the whole world.
In many ways, people say that Islam, technologically never recovered. Because Baghdad was the pinnacle. It was the capital of the world at that point.
Yeah, they said that the riverbanks blue for days because of all the books I think they used it to make as a path to get really across or something. They used it just for simply just as a tool to get across.
Well, as far as our scientific progress, that we were the pinnacle, cutting edge, and then in many ways we never recovered after that. So,
so at that point, Baghdad been sacked. The news of Baghdad getting sacked reached Egypt, and how did the Mamluks start preparing? What was the dynamics of what was going on in Egypt at that point?
Well, in Egypt, first they still had to rely on consolidating their power in Syria. So, like I said, they had to make sure that they wouldn't get attacked in their flank by the Crusaders, who were still there, like I said, on the coastal cities. So they were very afraid that the Crusaders would come back. They had just defeated them, but they had already launched 7 crusades. So who's to stop an 8th or a 9th crusade? So they actually did negotiate with some of those the coastal crusaders, and they actually got permission to cross their territory and basically ceasefire agreements with the crusaders. Like, you know, you can resupply in our land, you know, because you always have to be able to resupply, you know, sources of water and food and everything. So you can resupply and we won't attack you. Temporary truce. Because even though the crusaders hated, of course, you know, the Muslims and wanted to retake Jerusalem, they all realized their common enemy at this point was the Mongols.
Yeah.
Not that the Crusaders hadn't tried. They tried, you know, you may have heard of these stories of Prester John. So Prester John, they thought was going to be a Mongol. So they thought, oh, maybe we can convert them, or maybe he's Prester John. So he's going to be our ally, you know, against the
Prester John is like a saint, or
he's basically
like
this mythical
figure.
Eastern king that the Catholic Western European powers were always looking for as an ally against the Muslims. Now, it turns out he never existed, but, you know, they looked for him in Ethiopia. They looked for him in, you know, as far east as China.
I always theorized. Yeah, I thought there was their own version of Khidr.
Oh. Yeah, in some ways, you're right.
Was this like apocalyptic in their belief, or was this like an apocalyptic belief, like when they found this king, they would be able to...
it's like this messianic thing where they, you know, when they find this king, he's gonna...
Everything's gonna be fine.
Yeah, everything's gonna be fine. They'll be able to defeat the Muslims.
So it's kind of like their Mahdi, pretty much.
Yeah, almost.
Okay.
I mean...
Yeah, right.
So now they're consolidating the Holy Land, basically, and how are they preparing for?
Well, they're ensuring that they were often called Atabegs, right? So they're ensuring that they get the support of the Atabegs of places like Damascus and Aleppo and
who are the Atabegs?
The Atabegs are, again, usually Turkish or Kurdish rulers. Some of them were Ayyubid still in their loyalty. Yeah. Even though, of course, the Mamluks had displaced the Ayyubids, but still some of these... And this was the problem, is the disunity, right? Yeah. And this is one of the reasons why Baghdad itself fell. By the way, going back to Baghdad just real quick, the reason why it only took 2 weeks for it to fall is because, as usual, as we often talk about, the disunity of the Muslims, right, to this day. But that was one of the times.
There were no reinforcement for them.
Yeah, there was nobody thought that that Baghdad would fall so quickly or so easily, and they thought even if it came under attack, the siege would last a few months, and if they need be, they could reinforce it and help them out. Nobody thought that the Mongols would be so fearsome and so effective that in less than 2 weeks they would attack it. That's why it was such a shock. And also, that's why the Crusaders were successful too. The Mongols were successful against us and the Crusaders because the Muslims were all disunited at the time, right? So
even to the point they say that the vizier in Baghdad, he didn't get reinforcements to Baghdad soon enough because he was secretly allied with the Mongols.
Yeah, there's rumors about that too. Yeah, I wouldn't be certain. Politics is dirty business, right? Yeah. So, so they had to ensure that both the Crusaders and their fellow Muslims would actually at least, if not ally with them, would at least support them, help them resupply while they took on the Mongol threat. Now, what happened is, of course, the big Mongol that all of us love to hate, Hulagu again, the one who sacked Baghdad. Luckily, this was a big stroke. Now, military historians will say that, well, Ain-Jalut, some of them downplay Ain-Jalut, because what happened is, with the Mongols, their ruler, who was Mongke, he was at this point, he was the 3rd or 4th great Khan, the successor of Chinggis. He died all the way in Karakoram, which is, like 3,000 miles away in Mongolia. So what happens is they have this thing called a Kurultai, and a Kurultai is basically like a jirga or any council. Yeah. And everybody has to be there at present because they want to actually help nominate or like stand for.
It's like their shura.
Yeah, like their shura, exactly, like their shura council. And you have to be there. Obviously, you can't you can't make your own claim to be the next successor or support your allies unless you're there. So
and all battles end too, right?
Yes.
When the Kurultai is called.
Then the Kurultai is called.
Yeah, and they have to justify to the Mongols why they should be.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Khanate, basically. Yeah,
the next Khan of Khans.
Yeah.
So luckily for the Muslims, that actually happened right then. And so Hulagu takes most of his Tumens. The Tumens were like a legion or a division, about 10 to 15,000 soldiers. So he took most of his Tumens and actually went back east for the Kurultai. And I believe most people say about 2 Tumens were left. So maybe about 20,000, which is still a formidable force, but not nearly as big as it was before.
Right.
So this is what the Mongols had left with them. But they were still told to press, especially after they heard about what Qutuz had done to their, okay. Oh, so he beheads them and he puts their heads on, spikes at the gates. Okay, so we can't leave that.
Wait, the Mongols were undefeated. Did this happen? When did this happen?
Well, they learn about it, of course, through the grapevine, however you want to, their messengers don't come back.
No, I mean, so the emissaries reached Qutuz and they gave them the ultimatum, right?
This ultimatum, right?
And the emissaries were also executed by Qutuz and put their heads put on a spike. And this is not traditional Muslim behavior, but this is. I think a ruling that they made at that time based on the circumstances of the Mongols, because it was an unprecedented event in history where such a force was coming. They had to show some strength back and some form of intimidation back. It's in Islam traditionally we always protect the emissaries; they're always sacred. We have to throw that out there because people might get the wrong understanding.
But the Mamluks were like gangsters, though, no rules.
So they executed the emissaries, and then?
Yeah, they executed the emissaries, and then, like I said, they realized that they don't even want to let them come into Egypt, because Egypt is basically their last line of defense, Cairo.
Right.
West of Cairo, yes, of course, you have North Africa, and you still have Spain, but, the heartland of what we call Bilad al-Sham, that's it. Egypt is, after the sack of Baghdad, all that's left is Egypt, because Damascus has already been sacked by the Mamluks and besieged by the Crusaders multiple times. So Damascus is not going to hold out. So Egypt is also the source of much of the economic wealth of the Muslims. So
sorry, did you say sacked by the Mamluks or the Mongols?
By the Mongols.
Mongols, right?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I don't know. Yeah, my mistake if I said the Mamluks, but. So now like I said, they consolidate their power and they move into Syria because they know that that's where they want to confront them.
Right.
And they basically they hear about how their force has shrunk, so that really motivates them to try to crush them once and for all.
Right.
It turns out not to be the last time they meet in battle. They actually fight them several times again. But the famous pivotal battle of Ain Jalut is when, almost similar to the Battle of Hittin, they managed to draw them to this place called, very... historic biblical name almost, right? The Spring of Goliath, Ain Jalut.
Yeah.
And they, same deal. They managed to goad them into attacking them. And the Mongols are always very aggressive. Yeah. They like to give chase. But they should have known, because this was their own tactic, which they used many times. The Mongols' tactic was often to draw people into attacking them. So this time they had the tables turned on them. And the Mamluks had them attack until they went into the wooded hills, basically, where you couldn't fight as effectively on horseback, and then they managed to surround them and crush the 2 Tumens that they had, and it was a total complete victory. There was almost almost nothing
there
left.
were some circumstances around it too. Like I noticed that the Mamluks also used the refugees that came out of Bilad al-Sham to fight in the first defense, and I think in their planning they had a feeling that when the battle got fierce that they would actually retreat a little bit, and that would. And the Mongols would pursue them, and that's when they would try. So in the way I imagine in my mind, it's almost like an hourglass type of thing, where they were forced to narrow themselves, and then at the end, when they came out, they were able to surround them when they came out the other end.
They were very good tactically. They managed to pick the ground and the time and of attack, and that's how they were able to defeat them. You're right. They basically
I think
made
there
a
was
pincer
an epic
movement
moment too during that battle. There was an epic moment, I think, where Muzaffar Qutuz himself, was trying to protect the ranks from being broken, and I think he made a famous statement. I can't remember it, but I think
he basically said if you turn back, the religion will be destroyed, because if the Mamluks army could not hold this area I think was Syria, right?
Syria and Egypt.
So if they couldn't hold it, the rest of the Muslim world was unprotected, essentially. So the Mongols would have easily swept into North Africa. So basically, his famous rallying cry was essentially that if you run away, all is lost. And it was enough.
Yeah, people say he took off his helmet so that people would see it was him, the Sultan himself.
Yeah.
And then he says, for Islam, wa Islama, and then basically follow me. And that helped to hold the line.
So he rallied
them. It was about
them
to break. It was about to break their flank. And he was able to rally them that way. Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, Muzaffar, he protected not only the Muslim, but pretty much also Europe. I mean, if it would have come in from this place, I mean, for sure they would have advanced from North Africa all the way up to probably Europe.
Yeah. Well, of course, they had attacked places like Ukraine and Poland. And even laid siege to Vienna, by the way.
Oh, wow.
They'd gone as far as Vienna. And the same thing, because of the Kurultai, Vienna was saved. Because during the middle of the siege of Vienna, they had to go back for the Kurultai.
So a tragic thing happens after the Mamluks win and everything. Just like we see today, when Muslims do something amazing, there's another, one of our friends, Nabil, our guest in the previous podcast, he said, like crabs in a bucket, once one crab is getting out, the other crabs pull him back in. So this is what happened. Baibars does.
Well, people accuse him of doing that. Again, it's one of those things where we don't know 100%. But yeah, Baibars, who also fought very bravely in this battle, they were both there. Qutuz and Baibars were fighting. In fact, Baibars was in the vanguard. He was one of the main commanders fighting at Ain Jalut. But people say, of course, he had political ambition himself. And Qutuz never even really got to savor his victory as Sultan because...
What was it, like 2 years that he was...
assassinated.
In total rule? Was it a couple years, right?
I think it was less than 2 years. I think it was maybe only about a year and a half. If that,
So then he was assassinated?
He was assassinated. Just like I said, the Mamluks they had assassinated Abbasid sultans, they had assassinated Turan Shah, the last Ayyubid sultan, and now they were killing each other for political power, Right. So that's when Baibars takes over as the next.
And that, just having this conversation, it makes you realize that the fiqh in each time is a little bit different, and you see that not everything that we would see today and look back at the Mamluk period or any other Muslim period, and you'd say, "Oh, well, that's clearly wrong." And I think what I'm trying to say is that each setting had their own rules, and Islam is very dynamic in each land and time and place, and I think that's something that we can learn from too.
Just curious though, what happened to the Mongols after they were defeated in Egypt?
Well, they were still, of course, in control of China and Central Asia, all the way to Eastern Europe, including places like Ukraine and Poland. That's how big they were. So the Mongols, they finally pick the successor to Möngke Khan, and they come back. Hulagu comes back with all his Tumans, and he finds out what happens. But what happens is the Golden Horde, now that's Berke Khan, he was actually already Muslim at the time of the sack of Baghdad, and he was very upset by what his cousin, Hulagu was actually his cousin. And the Mongols basically, and Hulagu wants to punish the Mamluks for what they did at Ain Jaluth, but he's not able to because his Muslim cousin from the Golden Horde, Berke Khan, he actually launches an attack on him in alliance with Baibars and the Mamluks. So there's a Mongol civil war that happens, and then there's up to 4 more attempts to directly attack Cairo and Egypt. They mostly fought in the area of Homs, which is a famous city in Syria. Of course, Homs is also in the news these days. There were, I think, up to 4 battles of Homs. They have so many. There's a battle, multiple battles on the same site. I think there were 4 or 5 battles right outside that city. And I believe 3 of the 4 the Mamluks won. One of them they actually did lose to the Mongols. But they what basically essentially happens is the Mamluks, to their credit, and Ibn Khaldun, we all know who Ibn Khaldun is. He famously gives them the credit of decisively defeating both the Mongols and the Crusaders permanently from the heartland of Islam, and that is to their credit to this day. The last Crusaders left in about 1300, and defeated finally, like I said, from their coastal cities. by the Mongols, and the Mamluks are able to eject all the Mongols again by the early 1300s, except of course the ones who were Muslim, like their Golden Horde Sultanate up in Central Asia. So,
well, what was the lasting effects of the Mongols on Egypt, like that we can see till today?
Well, on Egypt itself, the Mongols themselves.
No, I'm sorry, not the Mongols, the Mamluks.
Oh, on the Mamluks. Well, as far as lasting effect, I mean they had to fight them. They were their mortal enemy for their first few decades. And
from what I understand, like they still have like a lot of architecture and a lot of other contributions they've made.
The Mamluks themselves, yeah, the Mamluks, of course. In Egypt, if you go to Cairo, the old city of Cairo, it's just you can't walk 10 feet without hitting the famous Bab Zuela to Bab al-Futuh. Of course, all of these, a lot of them were built by the Fatimids, but the actual masjids and madrasas and all these complexes, many of them within the Fatimid city, were built by the Mamluks. You'll see these what they call these onion domes and these famous madrasas that were endowed and to this day, some of them, the waqfs, the awqaf, were first founded by the Mamluks.
So the burning question for a lot of our listeners: why did we name the Mad Mamluks after the Mamluks? Is because the Mamluks were a unifying force in a pivotal period in history. That, as we learned from our esteemed guests, they were able to consolidate power. They were able to get all these different parties together to stop the Mongols. And they were not just, they didn't end over there, but they also formed a very multicultural society in Egypt, where all these different people from all over the world, Europeans, Oriental people, Mongolian people, all these people came to Egypt to learn from each other, grow, share knowledge, share art. So all these things came to play when we were trying to decide on the name for this podcast. And
I think the very fact that slaves were able to become rulers that had such an impact in the Muslim world is an amazing thing, because in a lot of ways right now we are in similar circumstances where we're disunited.
We're in a pivotal period, and
barrage of attacks. Maybe not physically all the time, but ideologically, definitely we're under a barrage of attacks, and we find constant challenges. And I think that what's interesting about the Mamluks is they were able to identify which fights to fight and when to make a truce, which is very strategic. And something that we have to also recognize in our time, because we're not going to be able to tackle every single problem right away. We have to be able to prioritize and then rally around the most important causes first, and then be able to deal with the other things. And the Mamluks were great at doing that. And we see that through their legacy.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anything else awesome that we can learn about the Mamluks for our times? I mean, it's pretty... Mort made a great point. I think all of us have to reflect on their impact and how... what we can do to make our society better. I think that's the whole point of this show, right? But it's a different beast today. It's not necessarily like a war of swords and whatnot. It's a war of the pen.
Yeah,
intellectually, and I think people like you. So what advice can you give? You're a pilot in your full-time profession. What advice can you give the average Joe who is working a 9 to 5 or whatever job they have? As far as understanding whether it's history, sociology, I think like that's what I'm getting from this show is that like, hey, you can't be like, it's very hard to be polymath, right?
Yeah.
In today's day and age, you can't be like, you probably don't know sociology or some political science, but maybe you should focus on one. That's the vibe I'm getting from you. Find something you're interested in and then kind of like deep dive it. Do you have any tips for our listeners once they identify a passion that they want to learn about and then, kind of dig in a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's part of, it can become an ibadah, like if you have the right intentions, then almost any activity, it doesn't have to be your ritual the rituals of Islam, your salah and fasting and these things. These are ritual ibadah, but everything can be an ibadah, right? So we have to educate ourselves and the people around us. Both many Muslims are so ignorant of our own history. That's why we have books like Lost Islamic History. Of course, you have your previous guest about this subject, and we don't know our own history, so we're not able to talk intelligently, both in terms of presenting it to non-Muslims who may be curious, and also just educating ourselves. And people attack us intellectually, like you said. We're always there's an onslaught against us. People think that we don't contribute to society, that we are fifth column, or that But then people like us, all of us here, and our listeners, we can tell. Well, no, you too can be an airline pilot. And we're not. TSA may try to. And the airlines might try to kick you off the plane. Well, actually, sometimes the people up front in the pointy end in the front office are actually Muslims too. Yeah. And we can teach them about treating us with a little bit more respect and hikmah, and that speaking Arabic is not a crime enough to get you booted off an airplane. And
awesome. So for anyone that's interested in learning about history, where would you tell them to start? Like if they wanted to start learning about this type of history and Islamic history, where would you point them?
I know a lot of people think history is a dry subject. So if you don't want to read, then listen to podcasts. There's so many. This is a great one. There's so many other podcasts.
You hear that, people? Listen to podcasts.
Absolutely. If you're not able, if you think that a book is going to put you to sleep, then listen. Just participate online. There's so many. These days there's really no excuse. Social media. You could talk, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or on a blog. Engage with people. As far as history goes, there's a lot of, Wikipedia is a funny source. It's a great source, but at the same time, anybody can go and edit. So if you see somebody saying something wrong on Wikipedia, you can approach them, or you can change it yourself, or you can tell them, hey, wait a minute, it's a little too controversial and political there. Yeah. Now, from our perspective, this is what actually happened, and try to engage them that way, So, but people say that the victors are the ones who always write the history books. So we can always try to even things out, even the playing field.
Sure. Very cool, man. Yeah, awesome. Jazakallah khair for coming on the show. It was a pleasure sitting down with you and really picking your brain here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And you're welcome to come back at any time. I'm sure we just talked about the Mamluks today, and I'm sure we can have you come back sometime and talk about something completely unrelated within history, but
it'd be my pleasure.
I've always been interested in like more modern day Middle Eastern history, right before the fall of the Ottoman Empire, etc. So maybe we can table that for next time, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Yeah, so for our listeners out there, if you have any questions or comments, you can email us at themadmamluks@gmail.com. You can also like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter at themadmamluks. We are on iTunes and Stitcher, where you can subscribe to us. And if you're on iTunes, please leave us a 5-star rating. For our special guest Asim Ahmed and my co-host Mort and Sim, this is Mahin signing off for the Mad Mamluks. Assalamu alaikum.